Welcome to this seminar at the Institute for Future Studies, occasioned by the new report from the Institute, Basinkomstens nya väg, lärdomar från medborgarexperiment i välfärdsstaten, or in English, New Waves of Basic Income, Lessons from Experiments with Basic Income in Welfare States. I am Ludwig Beckman. I am professor in political science at Stockholm University and at the Institute. I will share this event. The idea here is that we will have a presentation by the main authors of the report and then followed by a general discussion where you all are invited to participate. And the discussion will be managed in a way by you entering this Slido at the homepage. You can find instructions just below the streaming site, and you insert an event code 1020 and you put your questions there, and the questions must be rather short. There's maximum of 160 characters to make your questions there, and they will be forwarded although somewhat moderated by Julia Mosquera, who sits next behind me here. The main authors of this report are a collection of excellent researchers and prominent representatives of basic income studies from many different parts of the world. We have, first of all, our own Simon Birnbaum at the Institute for Future Studies, who is also an associate professor in political science at Södertörn University. He has published several books on basic income, and the latest one is Generational Welfare Contract, Justice, Institutions and Outcomes, together with Kenneth Nilsson, Thomas Ferrarini and Joachim Palme. Then we have Jürgen de Wispeler, is a policy fellow at the Institute for Policy Research at the University of Bath and also a visiting researcher at the Stockholm School of Economics in Riga. He has published widely on basic income and is one of the contributors to the World Bank report Exploring Universal Basic Income, a guide to navigating concepts, evidence and practices, that was published this year. We also have with us today Robert van der Veen, who is a political scientist at the University of Amsterdam. He is one of the founder of the Network for Basic Income Studies, BIEN, Basic Income Earth Network, that was founded already in 1986. We also have two other authors that are not with us today, but Antti Halmetoja and Ville-Veikko Pulkka, both from Universities of Tammerfors and University of Helsinki in Finland. So I'm very happy that we are having this seminar today on the occasion of this report, and I will now introduce Simon Birnbaum, who will begin with the presentation. Welcome, Simon.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here. So I also want to thank the Institute for Future Studies for inviting us here today, but more fundamentally for asking us to write this report and for supporting us, encouraging us along the way. And I'm also very grateful to my co-authors for joining this project and for making it possible. So I will now give a kind of general introduction overview of some of the things that we are saying in this report. We talk about a new wave of interest in basic income and basic income experiments. To begin with, I should say a few words about this concept of basic income, what it is. Basic income is usually defined as a periodic cash payment, unconditionally delivered to all on an individual basis, without any means test or work requirement. So the key thing to have in mind here is that there is no behavioral conditionality whatsoever. It's paid to everyone with no strings attached. You don't have to express your willingness to work or demonstrate that you have worked in the past in order to be eligible for this payment. There's no means test, so it's paid to rich and to poor. If other persons in your household, if they have incomes or don't have incomes, it doesn't matter. This is a personal right. It's something that you receive as an individual. Place of residence, things like that is irrelevant. It's paid to all. And it's also important to emphasize here that the idea of a basic income in discussions of the future of the welfare state, it's not the same as helicopter money or emergency payments. We have a lot of talk about these kinds of arrangements now in connection with COVID-19, but it's supposed to be a permanent arrangement. So it's like a child benefit. In Sweden we have barnbidrag, universal child benefits. It's very much like that. It's just for everyone, including adults. There are some key variations in this. There are different ways of developing this idea of a basic income. Often people distinguish between a partial basic income and a full basic income, dependent on whether or not it's sufficient to cover basic needs. And that in turn affects the potential of the basic income, of course, to replace other forms of income support currently in place. There's also distinction to be made here between a basic income, which is paid to all, rich and poor, and a so-called negative income tax, which is targeted to people with low incomes, but sharing this key feature of being unconditional with respect to willingness to work. Now, when we talk about this new wave of interest in basic income, that can seem a bit puzzling from a Swedish point of view. People perhaps don't experience this wave in everyday political discussions. So it's worth mentioning, giving you some examples of what we have in mind when talking about this new wave of interest. Many people have probably heard of the Swiss referendum that took place back in 2016. Here we can see a picture from this performance in Bern, where activists celebrated that they had managed to collect enough signatures for achieving this referendum. This was a referendum. The proposals discussed in that context were very radical, very high amounts. It was rejected in the end. I think it was 23% voting in favor of it, so it was firmly rejected. But this generated a lot of discussion on basic income. So I think this was a key moment where a lot of things began to happen around the world. More recently, many people have probably heard of Andrew Yang's campaign in the United States, in the primaries of Democrats. I mean, this was the key issue, the freedom dividend, he referred to it. This was really at the core of Andrew Yang's campaign. He was a presidential candidate before he endorsed Joe Biden. So this also generated a lot of discussion in the United States on basic income. I think fewer people have probably heard of some of these initiatives, which I think are very interesting. In Brazil, since December 2019, 43,000 inhabitants of Maricá, close to Rio, actually receive unconditional payments. These payments are provided in a local currency, so-called mumbucas, but they can be used for all kinds of purposes. And this is actually, I think Jürgen knows more about this than I do, but this is not just a basic income experiment or pilot. This is actual policy. And the idea is for this program to be gradually expanded. And by 2024, this is supposed to cover all the inhabitants of Maricá, currently 162,000 inhabitants. Recently, Ireland, the new centre-right government in Ireland, also expressed a commitment to a universal basic income pilot in the lifetime of the government. The Greens are also very active in supporting this government in Ireland. Scotland there has been a lot of discussion and work over the past few years on basic income pilots. They recently published a report on basic income pilots. There is strong political support. Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, very positive. She wants to have basic income pilots. The report concluded that it's desirable to move forward with pilots, but there are great technical, legal obstacles. They would depend a lot on London. So perhaps this requires Scottish independence, we'll see, to actually happen. But it's another interesting example. Some other examples of this wave that we're talking about, this wave of interest, there are some recent major reports coming out from institutions such as the World Bank that Ludwig mentioned, World Health Organization, ILO. These major reports were published just now over the past few years. So it's clear indication that there is a widening global discussion on basic income. So I think thinking about Robert's pioneering research back in the early 80s, this is quite a major development that we see discussions on basic income in the context of the World Bank, for instance. So why should we be talking about basic income? Well, we could discuss that question for several hours, of course, because there are so many different arguments on basic income. Many of those arguments are philosophical arguments, principled arguments, justice-based arguments. For example, many people talk about inheritance for all. There are certain assets out there to which no one has a prior desert-based claims. There are certain gift-like assets out there, inherited resources, natural resources. People should have some kind of equal entitlement to such resources, according to some arguments. Those arguments don't appeal to goals or beneficial effects. You can think that you have the right to do whatever you want with an inheritance. That's up to you. But experiments tend to focus much more pragmatic or goal-oriented arguments. The practical advantages of basic income or basic income-like solutions, having to do with preventing poverty while at the same time encouraging people's productive contributions or useful contributions of different kinds. It doesn't have to be in the labor market necessarily. So if you look at poverty prevention, there is kind of obvious advantages of basic income, that it offers an inclusive, non-stigmatizing safety net for everyone. So no one would kind of fall in between systems. And everyone would be provided with a certain degree of personal independence. You would not be in the hands of other family members or employers or anyone else. It's targeted to each particular individual. And so they would be provided with some resources to effectively exercise their basic liberties. But it would achieve these objectives, or could achieve these objectives, in a way that avoids various poverty traps, unemployment traps, bureaucratic obstacles to participate and work, according to many. So in conventional forms of income support, there are often very high effective marginal tax rates, for instance, for low income earners, people depending on social assistance. If you earn extra income, well, then your benefits will be reduced with the corresponding amount. There are many bureaucratic traps discussed in this research on basic income. It's often uncertain if you receive unemployment benefits, for instance. How does work, how do studies, volunteering, does that affect my eligibility for support? Would that risk interrupting my access to payments? And that may easily discourage people from taking all sorts of initiatives, because you don't want to jeopardize access to basic security. So the basic income, since it's not means tested, recipients are always economically better off if they work, even if it's just a small extra income that's kind of added on top of the basic income. It's paid with no strings attached. So that means there's no uncertainty whatsoever regarding eligibility for this uninterrupted access to payments. So there are no restrictions on activities at all. No need to ask for people's permission and so on in relation to caseworkers and others. Now, many of these discussions and arguments are based on familiar standard assumptions about economic rationality in neoclassical theory, based on self-interested motivation. That do people get better off if they work? Does work pay off? But this discussion of various kinds of bureaucratic traps or precarity traps are more central in behavioral economics research. Discussing how poverty-related concerns consume mental resources, leaving less for other tasks. I mean, being poor, being in a state of poverty, that consumes a lot of cognitive resources. All the worries, all the anxieties related to that condition. And in that condition, having to deal with navigating complex rules, having to comply with various conditions with those reduced capacities can be highly demanding. So some of this research that we're talking about in this report, the experiments, are guided by this way of thinking, that there are certain hypotheses generated by this research, suggesting that if people could kind of mobilize these energies, if they could have this firm foundation, this safe basic income to rely on, and they could mobilize these resources, I mean, focusing on improving their conditions instead of dealing with all this uncertainty, all these complexity, all these conditions. Perhaps that would be better for them also when it comes to finding work, finding jobs. So these are some of the arguments discussed here in the report. Now, why experiments? Well, it's clear that there are people have very strong, often assumptions about what a basic income would lead to. What kind of effects would it have? Some people think that this would help people. It would address poverty-related health problems. It would help support well-being. It would facilitate productive participation for all these reasons that I've mentioned. But of course, many have quite opposite views or assumptions about what would happen under this kind of arrangement. Would it perhaps result in a massive reduction of hours worked? Claes Eklund a few years ago presented a report on the future of work, emphasizing this risk that the willingness to work would be greatly reduced or could be greatly reduced under a basic income. And that is a major concern. That's one of the major reasons we should remain skeptical to this kind of arrangement. Perhaps people will kind of lose connections. Perhaps it will be bad for people's self-esteem. There is this idea that it perhaps would lead to social isolation. People would drop out of work, perhaps even lead to criminality. So Bo Rothstein, perhaps listening to this now, he argues in one passage or claims that there is a risk that a sizable portion of those who started adult life living on the basic income will seek to increase their standard of living with various kinds of irregular income, drug trafficking, prostitution, etc. So that's quite a different scenario, hypothesis. What would happen if people had this basic income? Now, experiments are very interesting because they could help us address these kinds of firmly held rival empirical assumptions. Now, in this context, we should emphasize it's important to be aware that we already have plenty of findings from earlier experiments and programs with unconditional income support. There were actually 5 negative income tax experiments conducted in the United States and Canada in the 1970s. There are also several experiments with partial basic income that have been conducted over the past years. Namibia, Madhya Pradesh in India, those are just a few examples. And I think it's fair to summarize that, the general pattern from these and similar programs is that there is a positive impact on health, well-being, gainful consumption. On the whole, people don't use this for, alcohol, drugs, things like that, but it improves their well-being, nutrition, and things like that. Past experience, we have not seen any massive, no dramatic impact on volume of work. And I list here just a few recent overviews of some of this empirical evidence research conducted on this. But still, we don't really know to what extent these findings apply to advanced welfare states today. For example, these effects do they tell us anything about what would happen if we would phase in a basic income in Sweden or similar economies, for instance? So that's why we in this report focus on recent initiatives then in Finland and Netherlands, advanced welfare states. In Finland, there was a 2-year experiment during 2017 and 2018, where we had the first randomized controlled trial. It's a national experiment with basic income. Unfortunately, it didn't become quite as ambitious as many people hoped in the beginning. It was restricted to focus on unemployed persons. So 2,000 unemployed persons received this unconditional income. This was initiated by center-right government, led by Juha Sipilä, and the focus was quite narrow. It focused on employment effects. How would the basic income affect employment, people's willingness to work? Experiments in Netherlands are less well known around here, and those are also very interesting. In fact, these are 9, to my knowledge. Robert knows more about this. 9 local experiments. So these are conducted at the level of cities, municipalities. These took place in the context of the so-called Participation Act. And this is all a bit unexpected and fascinating, because the Participation Act is something that we associate with very strong work requirements, quite the opposite of unconditional basic income. Workfare, that people need to, there are certain duties of reintegration. They need to be very active and show that they perform certain activities in order to receive their payments. But when this arrangement was introduced back in 2015, there was also that also left an opportunity for experiments, for implementing these workfare arrangements in different ways. And there is this Article 83 in this Participation Act that allows also the suspension of conditions. But the agenda here, kind of dictating what you're allowed to do within this framework, is very much on how do we get people to become self-supporting? How do we get people into work? But there is then a coalition. There was a coalition of researchers, local politicians, mainly on the left in this context, social activists, that took the initiative to do these basic income-like experiments in this context, which involves exempting treatment groups from this conditionality, exempting people from these duties of reintegration, but also arrangements relaxing the means test, allowing people to earn extra income. I'll say something brief now about the findings. Employment effects in Finland seem to be small. The basic income recipients did not work less. If anything, impact of basic income seems positive from an employment perspective. So I quote just from the summary here, official summary. The basic income increased the number of days of employment by 6 days. There are some design methodological complications here. So the official conclusion is that there is no clear effect. We can say that basic income recipients did not seem to work less. Whether or not they even worked more, it's more uncertain. We can go into that in discussion if you would like to, but I'll move on just so I leave time for the other authors of this book. Positive effects on well-being, health, and trust. That's interesting, I think. Basic income recipients were more satisfied with their lives and experienced less mental strain, depression, sadness, and loneliness. They also had a more positive perception of their cognitive abilities. So this is kind of linked to the hypothesis mentioned earlier: memory, learning, and ability to concentrate. Greater trust in others and in state institutions. This is what you can see from survey evidence. There are certain limitations of this, low response rate for the surveys, but it's still some interesting patterns emerging there. After we finished this report, there have also emerged some first findings from the Dutch experiment. So I just mentioned that. This is what we have up until now, and Robert can tell you more about the situation in the Netherlands now. But there was a report published in May this year, and on this exemption treatments for all the municipalities, these 6 experiments, the authors conclude of this evaluation, this first evaluation, we find no statistically significant effect of the exemption from the labor and reintegration obligations in social assistance on the outflow to work. So this is just a quote from the official first report then. Now, there are plenty of things to discuss here, clearly. Design issues, limitations, and paths forward. I think just stress a few things very briefly then. Our main concern with the experiment in Finland, but to some extent also the Dutch experiment, is that in the Finnish experiment, it turns out that many people in the treatment group, in the basic income group, still depended on conditional or means-tested transfer. So this is a partial basic income. And when that is the case, for instance, for families with children, there are extra payments for these groups. And in order to access those payments, basic income recipients had to apply for ordinary unemployment insurance to receive those extra payments. And then all these normal conditional, these conditions kick in. So there are major complications there. They did not fully kind of test the impact of unconditionality. The researchers were kind of aware of this, and it would have been desirable to integrate these added payments fully in the basic income program. Of course, the main limitation in both these contexts is the focus on employment, both in Finnish and Dutch experiments. Obviously, we would like to know much more about how this affects health and social outcomes much more broadly, volunteering, informal care work, things like that. And if people do work less or slightly less, what do they do instead? There's a narrowing focus here on the unemployed, social assistance benefit recipients. Obviously, we would like to know how this affects people much more broadly, other categories. And also, experiments here are relatively short. Ideally, we would like to have longer, more ambitious experiments. We would also like to have so-called saturation sites, local experiments where all persons in a city, for instance, are eligible for these payments. Now we have this randomized control trial. We have these scattered people scattered in a country or in a municipality, but with no opportunity to interact with each other. How would the social climate? How would culture? How would things? Are there community effects under a basic income? These things we have seen interesting examples of all this in other experiments, not least the Mincome experiment in Canada. These things we cannot see this in with this kind of research design. So. This is something we would like, thinking about. What should they do in Ireland? Well, we would like to see much more of this that I've indicated. Closer attention, more systematic attention to well-being effect, because that's what we tend to see, impact on well-being. That's where really interesting effects seem often to be found. So we'd like to combine these national randomized control trials with local so-called saturation sites where everyone in a particular area is entitled to unconditional payments. It's also interesting to notice in this context that there are other experiments going on. And one of the most ambitious experiments going on at the moment is the one in Kenya, which is a 12-year experiment involving 20,000 recipients. This is organized by the organization Give Directly, going on now in 196 villages. So this will also be interesting to follow, especially considering this possible difference between short-term and long-term, the effects of short-term and long-term forms of basic income. So I will conclude now. It's also interesting, finally, to say something about the politics of all this. Does this bring us closer to the political implementation of basic income? The fact that governments and other actors commit to basic income experiments or pilots? The answer is no. And we can see that. I mean, it's often the case that, okay, governments commit to experiments, but this can be a way of kind of cooling off a political issue, showing that, okay, we take this seriously, we give this group an experiment, and then we kind of leave it, and then this will go on for a few years, and then when the findings come, when the evidence comes, it's often, there's no interest, and then the discussion is dead. So in this context, I think basic income activists and anyone interested in a full, complete, transparent evaluation of findings need to keep pressure on politicians and other key actors, not just take this wait and see approach. But this is one of our reflections or findings in studying what's going on also in Finland now at the moment. So basic income experiments, it's clearly not necessary for achieving a political implementation of basic income. We've seen, child benefits, universal transfers of various kinds, pensions, all of these things, they were implemented without experiments or pilot projects. And it's also not, sufficient. It's no guarantee that we're moving closer to basic income, but still, it can be very valuable. It can be valuable as a source of kind of evidence-based analysis of these ideologically contested assumptions about the impact of unconditional income support. It's also very useful often to allow us to better see how a basic income would actually fit into a pre-existing policy environment. It's often hard to kind of predict fully what will happen if we introduce something like this. And that's something we could see in Finland, this interaction that I mentioned between basic income and other programs. And thereby it can help us provide a more solid basis for also developing more sensible policy proposals. So, thank you.
Thank you, Simon, for this very interesting presentation. We will now continue with comments from your co-authors, and we will begin by giving the word to Robert van der Veen in Amsterdam. Go ahead, Robert.
Yes, well, thank you very much for this fascinating presentation, and I'm very happy to be here online with so much interest in basic income, and especially about what is going on in Holland. What happened in the Netherlands, actually, as Simon explained, is that a coalition of local politicians and activists and left-minded people who have been interested in basic income for years and years got together and tried to make use of these legal possibilities of instating experiments at the municipal level. Now, what I should make very clear is that in contrast with Finland, these experiments did not really involve a partial basic income, let alone a full basic income, but just some relaxation of and modifications of the conditions of this very Victorian, very workfare-oriented participation act in the direction of basic income, notably with two treatments in the random controlled trial experiments in these cities, namely exempting people from the duty to seek work and attend all sorts of courses and activities by the welfare agencies in order to bring them push them towards the labor market. So they would be in this treatment group exempted from that. And the other aspect, very important, of basic income, of course, is that you seek work on your own, you earn something, and you are entitled to keep it. That is what a basic income does. And in stark contrast to the participation law where all the income you earn is subtracted from the entitlement to income, providing a huge employment or poverty trap. So these are the two main treatments. But following all these hypotheses about the effects of poverty and the undermining effects on social trust between welfare administrators and the clients, there's also another treatment very relevant in this whole experimental research, which has nothing to do with basic income, and that is to give people more intensive, tailor-made kinds of coaching. So that means that there's a big role for caseworkers in their interactions with clients, and the idea is that freeing up cognitive resources of poor people by making the arrangements easier to understand for the clients and giving them the assurance of trust on the part of the welfare administrations, and in particular the caseworkers, would be also very good for people and would also lead to positive effects, not only on labor supply, part-time work, full-time work, outflow, or keeping a part-time job you had already, that kind of thing, but also, and very importantly, on the other variables, which are so important in the discussion on basic income. And the idea would be that here, both exemption, financial incentives, and intensive coaching would promote well-being, better health, more trust in the doings of the welfare agency, more ease of cleaning up your financial situation. Most of the people in social assistance have persistent debt problems, so that's also a very important thing too. And so that is part of the experiment, and it has not been reported by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, which Simon mentioned in the presentation. That report mainly says, well, of course, these experiments were conducted in a generally okay way, excepting 3 cities that were methodologically not very sound. But the main result on labor supply, be it full-time or part-time, is that there is no significant positive effect. Now, that point is almost true. I think they forgot to say that in one city, Utrecht, there is a positive effect of all 3 of these measures. So both exemption and intensive coaching and financial incentives on part-time work. But okay, that is the only thing, and that is still a very weak effect, and nothing to, as we would say in Holland, nothing to write home about. However, on the other variables of health, well-being, and trust in social interaction within welfare agencies, there were effects, and those effects should not be swept under the table. And of course, if a Ministry of Social Security gives an explicit instruction on this governmental think tank to analyze the results of the experiments only with employment in mind, then of course these other things get swept under the table. But those things have been very important, and I think they will continue to give an incentive mostly in political parties on the left to put pressure on the government to continue with these experiments. So, okay, now let me finally make one point about what the political chances of these experiments might be in the future, given the political situation that has now ensued after the COVID pandemic. So, and there I think the prospects are not they don't give reason for optimism at all, because of two things. First of all, basic income in these experiments is very heavily focused on the fate of social assistance recipients, not of people who are actually in work. Whereas, of course, as Simon explained, a lot of the advantages of basic income have to do with how people who are out of work and in work will respond to unconditional income payments at the level of basic needs. And at the moment in Holland, this interest in how social assistance recipients are faring is almost nil. And this is just because the pandemic, which hit from April to now, consumes massive resources in keeping people in work by giving employment subsidies and also giving social support to people with small businesses in order to make them continue with those businesses. So there the idea is that even though those payments are in part easy to get, so the conditions are not very restrictive because of the time factor involved. In order to apply for these things, you need only a few weeks, but they have nothing to do with how people in social assistance are actually living or what problems they are encountering. And you should also think about social assistance as not a reservoir of people that can be mobilized for work instantly. For instance, in Utrecht, 3/4 of the social assistance population taking part in these experiments are people who are unemployed for more than 2 or 3 years, and they have almost no chances of getting a job in the near future anyway. So if you realize this, then you can see that all these experiments which focus on this group, which in Holland would be about, at the moment, under 500,000 people, they have no relevance for what is going on in coping with the pandemic and preserving the economy against the disastrous effects of people being thrown out of work and businesses upending. And nor have they to do with the new possibilities of people to start up new businesses in the pandemic. So therefore, I think we will have to wait quite a long time before improved experiments along the lines of the Dutch experiments are going to be instituted again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. And I'll give the word to Jürgen Lewis-Blair.
Okay, thanks very much, Ludwig. I want to start by thanking, IFFS for, initiating all this, and particularly Simon Birnbaum, of course, for involving Robert and I into this report. It's really interesting, actually, to work with Robert. Just as a little anecdote, my first ever conference in Basinkomstens was a big event organized by Robert in '98 in Amsterdam. It's only taken us 22 years to follow up on this. So, but finally here we are. So I want to just bring a couple of more general reflections. I'm not going to go into too much detail on the Finnish experiment, in part because I think it's probably much better known than what's been happening in the Netherlands. But I did want to kind of bring out some more general reflections. They very much build on, well, of course, the report, but also in a sense building on what Simon was saying and touching on a few points that Robert made as well. So the first point I want to make is the fact that, basic income experiments are really policy experiments. That means they have this weird feature that they have to bridge the science aspect and they have to bridge the politics aspect. And this is really important. So my understanding of this, or my view on this, is that politics is really what starts off many of these experiments, often quite literally. I mean, we've seen this in Finland. The experiment didn't start until Juha Sipilä announced it as part of the government program. And more recently, we've seen exactly the same thing happening with, the new Irish government. So the Irish government, as Simon showed in his slides, has also announced, very similar to the Finnish thing, that they want to do a pilot. So that's what kicks it off to start with. But moreover, I mean, politics obviously influences pretty much every step along the way. Politicians or the government or, political stakeholders is what provides the funding. They often provide some of the background expertise, including around implementation, etc. Right? So they're providing a lot of opportunities. They're also, imposing a lot of constraints on this, as one would expect. So there is a sort of a clear sense of which the science and the politics, we need to understand basic income experiments as bridging those. And both sides are important. So the implications, for example, of basic income experiments also being political, they have major implications on things like design and implementation. So one aspect that's often discussed is the timeline. So, the Finnish experiment, for example, is 2 years. It's been heavily criticized by many people all over the world, saying that it's too short. And research scientists, they really, really would love to have these longer experiments. We'd love to have them 4 years. We'd love to have them more if we could. But the election cycle, the political aspect of it, the election cycle just operates at a very different level. We're talking about 4 years. And, the government who initiates this, so to speak, wants to have everything done within it. You're talking about a year of preparing, 2 years running the experiment, and a year of evaluating. And there's your election cycle, right? So what to do with this? One important lesson we can take from this actually is that it's quite dangerous for scientists to try and ignore the political cycle here. And the best example is what happened in Ontario. Some of you may be familiar that Ontario, the province in Canada, also started an experiment. They did this a year before the elections. Elections happened, new government got in place. Two things immediately happened. The first one is that they reduced the price of beer, and the second thing is they canceled the pilot immediately. For no good reason. They literally said we're going to cancel the pilot because it didn't work. It didn't even start properly yet. So it makes no sense. But the lesson is very clear. If you're going to expand across the election cycle, you better make sure that everything is hardwired, that the funding is in place, that no one's going to intervene, etc. So that's a good example of how politics and science needs to find a way to live together, and on the sort of design implementation front. It also affects evaluation. So we've already mentioned this a few times, but pretty much every government that initiates a basic income experiment, they all wanted to focus on employment effects. And in one sense, that's perfectly reasonable. It's exactly what we would expect. In another sense, though, it's a bit unfortunate. It's unfortunate first because it's actually really, really hard to get experiments going within these remits that actually can show you proper employment effects. And, both Simon and Robert have mentioned a few things. So, in terms of the sampling that we use often, sometimes, we often have just too small a sample to find any major impact here. Sometimes the samples are just focused on the wrong groups, as Robert was saying. And this happened in Finland as well. We're looking at unemployed people. We're not looking at people who are already employed and see what happens there, right? So it's very, very focused. We're often, again, talking about too short of a time frame for people to make structural changes in their life. And, we can't really accommodate any structural effects in many of these experiments. And that's a big problem, right? So, you're basically sort of assuming that a basic income experiment is going to impact the labor market. But the big chunk of the labor market, the supply side, so to speak, is just, the employer side, rather, is taken out of the equation, right? So that's a problem. So again, something we need to figure out with. So on the science side, we're always going to have to try and find workarounds and figure out the compromises. And it's really important when we sort of start analyzing these experiments and we start evaluating them that we appreciate that often enough these are compromises. They're not necessarily compromises that researchers are happy with. The Finnish team that was led by Olli Kangas initially proposed variations of models that we would like to test. The government basically decided, no, we're not going to do this. We're only going to test the one model, and that's it. That's not exactly what we had in mind, but, it's what we have to work with. So what to do with this? Well, one way is to try and sort of, as researchers, to constantly battle this and try to insulate the experiment as much as possible. And my view on this is that I think that's pretty much a non-starter, and I think it's also counterproductive in terms of making use of an actual window of opportunity that is created as governments are launching these experiments. Because keep in mind, this is really turning to the policy dimension. I mean, we need to appreciate that when a government basically says, look, we're interested in launching one of these experiments, they're not just thinking about this of, we need to keep our scientists busy. They're actually interested in really sort of checking out whether there's an actual policy opportunity here. So we need to work with that. So instead of trying to insulate experiments, perhaps there's a sense in which we should genuinely embrace the policy experiment dimension in a better way, right? Of course, we need to safeguard the whole scientific integrity around this, right? But at the same time, we should be able to do this while still, making sure that we still make use of the policy window that's offered on this. And here, I think, in a weird sort of way, Finland is a good case of possibly what we shouldn't be doing. In Finland, very much what happened is the moment the experiment started, and even before that, when it was researched, there was this general sense that we need to let the researchers do their thing, right? We need to let them do their thing, hands off, everyone keep quiet. We'll just sit here for a couple of years, then a year more for evaluation, and then we'll have a debate. Well, guess what? 3 years of sitting on our hands, so to speak, right? And, politics had moved on, right? I mean, every party in the meantime, we had an election, right? Or they had an election. I'm not Finnish, actually. There was an election. Everyone was putting forward their social security programs. No one was paying attention to the basic income experiment. It all went in an opposite direction. And that's where we are now. The experiment launched its results, and it pretty much seemed to have become dead on arrival. It landed dead on arrival, so to speak. I haven't seen much policy take-up since the experiment results were launched. I actually checked with some of my Finnish colleagues, and they confirmed this. So the general sense of the politicians is that window was kind of closed already while we were just sitting there. And that's a shame. So, so do we have some results? Yes, we do. But they're already subject to interpretation, etc. But most importantly, where will that get us in terms of policy development is not clear at all. So that's the first big point. And it's a challenge for future experiments, pilots, and I'm thinking again, Ireland. I want to make a second point, and I'll make that very brief because I know I'm getting into the time here. Sorry, I have a cat that keeps interfering here. So a second quick point to make is that when we're looking at experiments, we often get perhaps too bogged down about the whole behavioral effect issue. There's another very, very important aspect to these experiments, to the extent that they work as a pilot as well. And the aspect here, and this is something again that Simon mentioned and that we're also mentioning in the report, is one of the most tricky features of a basic income is to think of how it interacts with the whole policy environment. If you introduce something like a partial basic income in an advanced welfare state, that means that policy has to interact with a whole host of other programs. And actually, we can try and figure this out on paper, but a lot can go wrong there. So you do want to have a piloting experience where you can really figure out the nitty-gritty of what could potentially go wrong when you mix a basic income or when you throw a basic income into the welfare mix. And Simon mentioned something in respect to Finland that I think is very important as well. We've realized as the basic income experiment was implemented that many of the recipients are still being part of this conditional sanctioning regime, the natural regime, if you like, the regular regime. And this is because, they were basically told that, look, the basic income is just partial, but if you have children, you're entitled to a top-up, so you can apply for that, but that puts you into the regular regime. Or, to safeguard future entitlements, etc., you need to do this as well. But how do we interpret this? How do we interpret the fact that part of your income is unconditional, but part of your income means that you're fully embedded into a regime that means, again, several times in the week, you need to possibly meet someone, you need to apply for jobs, you need to report on this, and so on and so forth. So we're not entirely clear how these two things work together, right? We're not clear on how this is going to work in terms of the experiment, how does this really affect the results? But also, we're not quite clear how this is going to work into the actual basic income reality if we were to implement it. And in that sense, the experiment as a pilot, it really can give you very valuable information in terms of what this potentially could be as a full-blown policy. So we shouldn't just focus on the behavioral stuff. We actually really have to think about this as part of a policy process as well. Those are my 2 points.
Thank you so much, Jörgen. So we're now moving over to the next stage of this seminar, where we open up for a general discussion. And we have already received a couple of questions sent to Julia here next behind me. And I also have some questions here from others that have been sent before. So I just open up with one question that I was myself thinking about when I read the report and when I listened to you, which I hope might be interesting to discuss. I mean, first of all, there are 2 different kinds of questions we might be interested in asking here. I mean, one is the question about these experiments, how they worked, what kind of effects that we can actually confirm on the basis of them. And there is another kind of interest that we might have in just discussing the feasibility and justification of universal basic income as such, which is not necessarily, and that's something you actually point out in the report, which is not necessarily dependent on the results of these experiments. And my question, perhaps, I hope, will sort of touch upon both parts. And there's one thing that is often emphasized in the arguments for universal basic income, and you mentioned it several times in your presentation, Simon, and that's the unconditionality and the inclusiveness of universal basic income, that it's actually given to everyone without conditions. But there seems to be at least one condition that also might be exclusionary, and that's the fact that you are the member of the group that actually receives universal basic income. So, and this seems to have affect both I was wondering about, firstly, how this affected the experiments, because it means that only some people in these countries were a part of these experiments. So there were also people living there that were excluded from the basic income. And could you study, or were you interested in studying whether that had a negative effect on them, those people who were excluded from receiving the basic income recipient or the support? But the second and perhaps more general question about that is, well, how do you implement? What does it say about the feasibility of introducing universal basic income in one country or in one jurisdiction? As for example, you mentioned this place in Brazil where there was a sort of municipality and a local government that had introduced universal basic income. How does that work when people in neighboring local residences, local jurisdictions, don't have a basic income? Do they want to move there? Or, I mean, is that a fear among politicians or perhaps among populations that we can't introduce it because it will just attract too many people moving here and so forth? So yeah, that's a sort of set of questions about the inclusiveness of basic income. Would you like to start with responding?
Yeah, that's a lot. Very interesting questions. Perhaps I could just say one thing, and then I can leave for Robert and Jörgen to say more. But I think, this question kind of brings attention to one of the points that I made and indicated that, it would really be interesting to have more of local experiments with these so-called saturation sites where everyone in a particular community receives the basic income. Jürgen mentioned this, that you cannot see the structural effects on the economy with these kinds of national randomized controlled trials, for instance, because they have a very marginal impact on the economy. People are spread out in Finland throughout the country. But there are studies, actually, one by David Kalnitsky on the basis of data from the Mincam experiment, where everyone in a city received were eligible, low-income earners were eligible for payments, where this indicated that there were some work reductions, but also that wages increased as a result of that. So these are some of the things some of the dynamics that we are not able to detect or analyze on the basis of these kinds of research designs that we've seen so far in these countries. Is there anything we can say on this inside or outside? What do you say, guys?
Yeah, Jürgen or Robert, you have comment on this?
Oh yeah, well, let me just comment on one aspect of what you said in the beginning, where you say that you would be interested to see what the link is between the experiments with basic income and the more or less philosophical justifications. And I think there is a very clear link, because I think one source of justification mentioned by Simon, which is the general idea that out there in the economy and in society, there is this huge bundle of resources to which no one has any preordained claim, and which could be divided up equally between people who are ex ante equally deserving. That idea is something that basic income can build on. I think this is the major step towards justifying an unconditional payment to all as an economic translation of this idea of having an equal claim to the share of resources to which no one has any preordained claim, right? That's fine. But now the link with the experiments is interesting, because when you look at this idea of dividing up the income from these unused or these resources floating out there equally, equal might be equal in terms of an equal unconditional amount, or of an equal entitlement tied to certain conditions. So the conditionality versus unconditionality reappears at the moment where you accept the idea that people should have an equal claim to the resources to which no one has a claim, and the idea that this equal entitlement can be filled in different ways. Now, I think that the most important contribution of experiments is to flesh out the debate on this conditionality in terms of the effects it has. So this is not a theory of justice merely, which appeals to an entitlement, but it is also a theory of the good, which appeals to the effects of the equal entitlement, and which can be varied according to what kind of entitlement we have. Is it work conditional? Is it tied to households? Do you have to participate in education if you can, etc., etc.? All those types of conditions have different effects. And to translate this very abstract idea into welfare states, you can focus on the population that is most likely to benefit from all these forms of equal entitlement, and that is general or social assistance population, being the most poor, the most excluded, etc. So there, I think, there is a clear sense in which experimentation feeds into the general normative debate on basic income, and this is also one reason why in all countries, whether it is Switzerland, Canada, Kenya, or India, or Holland, or Sweden, all the most heated controversies revolve around the type of conditionality attached to an equal entitlement. And that is why these discussions are so important, and they need to be, improved in terms of evidence-based knowledge, and that is why experimentation is important. And even though it might be at any point in time, as it is in Holland now, politically not so relevant anymore, it is important to keep up the scientific and political and philosophical energy to conduct them over a longer period. And I think actually that is what is going to happen. That is my long-term intuition on the importance of these experiments.
Thank you. Well, we have some questions also from the general audience, and I think Julia has at least one question here ready to.
Yes, so good afternoon, everyone. I've been keeping track of the online audience, and we've got a number of good questions. So I thought I would start with one of the most voted questions. And this comes from Gunnel Axelsson Nykander from the Act Church of Sweden. And this person posts the following. In South Africa, the long-standing debate on basic income is high on the agenda. What is the likeliness that the temporary COVID grant will be transformed into basic income?
Yeah.
All right, you get that? Question about South Africa and the COVID grant. Jürgen, would you like to respond to that?
Well, okay. Let me start by saying that I've not much to say about South Africa. Okay? So because to be honest, this is beyond my realm of expertise, so I wouldn't even want to venture a guess. But South Africa isn't the only place where people are now looking at pushing for something like a temporary basic income and thinking of whether this might actually be a way to open up another policy window, if you like, for something like a UBI. I do think it's actually really, really interesting at the moment. Surprisingly, if you look at the sort of measures that governments are taking, earlier I was mentioning that in Finland, the window is closed, it seems, for basic income in the sense that their regular plans for social security are all going towards, Denmark, basically, rather than basic income. But during COVID, of course, they did actually institute some measures that, that relaxed conditionality, made it much more inclusive, et cetera, and plenty of countries are doing this in a temporary measure. So whether we can build on this to then actually push for something like a more permanent grant, that is, that remains to be seen. Very interestingly, if I'm allowed to sort of make a little point that's related to this, you could actually flip it around as well. There's actually an argument to say that having something like a universal basic income in place makes it much, much easier to actually respond to COVID. And the best example where this happened is Maricá. This is the municipality that Simon was mentioning near Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. So Maricá, since the end of last year, had a very small basic income grant that was targeted to about, 40% of the population. That's not nothing, right? So as soon as COVID hit, what they actually did is they basically just inserted more money into the pump, so to speak. So they were able to crank up the support, and it was really easy to do it very, very fast because they already had the mechanism in place. So there are interesting links between, COVID, the potential of a temporary basic income, but also the universal basic income, right? But it may actually work the other way around. So we may think about universal basic income in terms of pandemic preparedness for future pandemics, rather than, whether this immediately helps us now. So,
thank you. That was very interesting, the link you identified there. Shall we take another question?
Sure, we can take another question. A question that seems to be quite interesting for everyone is the following from Axel G. Is there any discussion of the possible global impact of a spread of basic income, for example, as a tool to help development?
Global basic income on a global basic income on a global scale. Who wants to comment on that? Robert, do you have thoughts on it?
Basic income on a global scale is subject to quite a lot of problems. So one of course is that it doesn't seem very viable idea. So there's no chance that we will have a basic income at a global level in the near future, or even in the medium-term future. And that, of course, means that otherwise there would be sort of lots of intellectual resources being invested in this problem. But at the moment, that is not the case. So the main point is basic income at what level? So if you take this question to mean an unconditional payment fine-tuned to people's situation, as I think on a global level would be reasonable, then the first thing that has to be worked out is what are these levels? Within one country, certainly a large country, but even I think in a country like Sweden with a fairly small population, the difference in living standard or the difference in costs and generally the access to infrastructure and all those things varies a lot. And so, but there at the national level, this problem doesn't appear because there is a social minimum anyway. So I think that to get a discussion of basic income at a not even a global level, but a level above the national community underway, you should actually be thinking about how living standards compare. And there is, to my knowledge, no real discussion of that going. So don't forget, basic income has two aspects. One is an unconditional entitlement, but the other one is, and that's also extremely important, as Jürgen has just illustrated by talking about the difficulties of partial basic income. The second characteristic of basic income is that it is at the level of conventionally defined decent living standards. And I think one of the things that you want to do when you talk about the global basic income idea is to think about this first.
Thank you. Well, we can stay for a little bit on this international arena. There is one more question here that was posed by Professor Bo Rothstein from Gothenburg that I had been sent. Was sent by mail. And it connects to this pretty well, I think. I'm reading the question as he wrote it. Progressives and the left have historically put a lot of trust in the state as the institution that will be used for increasing social justice. However, we know that most states are not very reliable. Even if democratic, they are often plagued by various forms of corruption, clientelism, and authoritarian tendencies. A fair estimation is that about 75% of the world's population live under such states at present. The basic income on a global scale is also going to be implemented by states. So my question is why we should expect states to carry out this policy in a fair and just manner. Given what we know about states, is it not time for progressives to rethink this high trust in the state? So what do you think? Do we want to reflect on that, Simon?
Well, it's a big question. One question, of course, there is what's the alternative? I know Bo Rothstein has done a lot of research on quality of government, emphasizing very much the importance of the impartiality of the perceived impartiality of state institutions as a precondition for building robust, well-functioning welfare states. And I think we share a research agenda there. I mean, what are the mechanisms here, and where do we begin? How do we build that kind of impartiality, and how do we build a foundation for trust in state institutions? And I think Bo Rothstein himself has very often emphasized the importance of universalism and universalist structures within the welfare state as a key to building that kind of process. And obviously basic income relates very strongly to that feature of the welfare state. But I'm sure, Robert, and you.
But is one way of interpreting this question, isn't it, to say that there is a two-step process, at least here, that first you need to establish sort of non-corrupt public institutions, and only then you can start thinking about what kind of welfare state policy programs we should have. And if that's true, then it means that universal basic income cannot be implemented or should not be tried to implement in countries which haven't succeeded on step one.
Yeah. Well, if that is true, it's hard to do much at all with any kind of ambitious welfare state structure. So it's not a problem unique to the basic income.
Sure.
And in some environments, people say that, well, basic income is very simple. It's directed to individuals. So there is better potential with that kind of policy instrument compared to more complex bureaucratic arrangements in actually helping individuals and finding ways around a corrupted bureaucratic structure. It's more simple in that respect.
Thanks. Do you have any comments, Robert or Jürgen?
I think you actually. Oh, sorry. Okay, you make your point.
Yeah. Okay. So I think one of the interesting features of basic income is, or to put it in this general context of sort of corrupt societies and corrupt states, and especially sort of issues around clientelism, public clientelism. Right? So I mean, I live in Latin America. I live in Chile at the moment, so this is very live around here. So one of the interesting features, of course, of something like basic income, that it's more likely to be immune to the sort of clientelist processes that you would get with a lot of other schemes. I mean, by virtue of it being universal, unconditional, automatic. So the big question basically seems to be, I mean, are states going to implement it? And, is there a sense where the basic income, once implemented, can be robustly protected, right? Protected against sort of general interference, i.e. whether they can stop the program, whether the funding is going to get decreased, those sort of issues, yes, right? So that's always going to be debate. But like, as Simon already said, I mean, every policy in some sense is subject to that. But one of the things that I think makes basic income really interesting in a sort of a more clientelist context like Latin America is precisely that it does seem to avoid the sort of obvious sort of political clientelist interactions that you would get in a lot of other programs. And if I can just make one quick point, and it partly relates to the issue around the global impact and development thing, by linking it. I mean, Robert was talking about a global basic income. I interpreted that question slightly different in terms of the global discussion around basic income and development. And I should perhaps mention that CEPAL, which is the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, which is the big UN commission in Latin America here, they've actually come out a few months ago with a report saying that Latin America should seriously consider a basic income, a low partial basic income, as part of really building up a social protection program, in the region. And that is very much a region, where you have serious corruption, where you have sort of semi-authoritarian states. I mean, Chile is an example, Brazil is an example, and so on and so forth. So I think there's some really interesting features going on in this particular sort of types of areas. So.
Thank you. We'll move on to further questions from the audience.
Yes, so we have now a question that is perhaps more related to the technical aspects behind experiments. I thought we could take that one now. So this comes from Stefan Granlund from SLU. Are there any qualitative data collection methods used in the basic income experiments in Finland and the Netherlands, or mostly RCTs?
the final report from the Finnish experiment was published in May, just before we were going to kind of finish up our report. So we just integrated something brief on those general findings. It's only been published so far in Finnish. We hope there will, and this is still a bit kind of work in progress. There will probably be more research coming out in the future. But I think one of the interesting things in that final report that I read using Google Translate was, I think it was 88 interviews with people participating in this treatment group, people receiving basic income. That is clearly an example where there is qualitative data involved, giving some more flesh to this general this survey data, these statistics, where you can see, I think, relating back to Rothstein's question, I think there were interesting things there relating to universalism and trust. I think that is a general, an interesting pattern of findings. The improved trust also in relation to state institutions linking to this universalism, these kinds of hypotheses. But it's, I mean, obviously very interesting to read these interviews and getting a more lively sense of how people actually experienced their situation, how it changed through basic income. So that's one example from these experiments that I'm aware of where there is some interesting qualitative data.
Just a curious follow-up on what you just said. Do you ever detect sort of negative experiences from people participating in your universal basic income experiments? Are people ever sort of frustrated by something or feel that they have been, that they are suffering simply?
I don't know. What do you say, Jürgen?
Well, I mean, it depends on which group which group you are assigned to. So in the Dutch experiments, which are sort of random controlled experiments, and you are just assigned to some group. And of course, you can have a lot of negative experiences in that group. Let me just give an example from a city. Let me look it up. Oh yes, this is from the city of Groningen, where people were put into a group called the so-called exemption group. So they were subject to no welfare state rules of entitlement for getting their income. They were relieved from all kinds of work duties, seeking job, etc. Some of these people have reported decidedly negative impressions and negative feelings on a scale of, how do you call it? I think subjective welfare would be the good translation, precisely because the welfare agency leaves these people alone, and they find that they are very disappointed by this. They were not choosing to have a basic income. They were just participating in this experiment and happened to end up there. So that is one very good example where, of course, it's very contextually defined, where basic income is not really supposed to be the all-encompassing panacea for welfare recipients. And this is because they still think, and this is my interpretation, these people still think that they should be willing to work, that they should be able to seek a job. Now they get an income and no assistance at all from the welfare bureaucracy, and they feel out in the cold because they still have this idea that they are, like everyone else, right, supposed to be working. Now here you have an example.
That's very interesting. So people are having the welfare state have a social component, that is, that people get used to. They want to have that kind of contact with someone representing the welfare system and not be left alone with this. Well, some people at least. Yeah.
And that is why in these Dutch experiments, the contrast between the effects of the two treatments that simulate the basic income, namely the unconditionality with respect to work duties and the possibility to earn whatever you earn and keep keep your stipend. Those things should be compared to the, let's say, much warmer contact between the bureaucracy and the recipient, mediated by these people who are supposed to help you navigate all the problems of seeking work, maybe direct you to voluntary activities and all that stuff. Now, lots of people like that, and they prefer that to a basic income. So that is one thing that is really emerging from these Dutch experiments, that it's not all about basic income versus a stony-faced, sadistic bureaucracy. No, it's also about warm contacts with understanding welfare agents, right? So I think that is a major point, which is surprisingly strongly attested by the experience in many of these Dutch cities.
Maybe it's a Dutch phenomenon. You have a warm bureaucracy in Netherlands. No, but so are there?
Not in Sweden.
Maybe we do too. Yeah. So we have another question here.
Yes, so we have a long question from Gustav Arrhenius, who is also in the audience, so we can take it now perhaps. So there is a well-known problem in experimental research known as the Hawthorne problem. People in the experiment may change their behavior and answer to survey questions because they know that they are in an experiment with a certain purpose and not because of the treatment itself, in this case the basic income, that researchers want to test. The basic income is, as you say, an ideologically charged issue, and it is likely that this will affect the participants in the experiment. These effects can be very huge, in some cases nullifying the effects of the treatment. I wonder why you do not discuss the possible effects of this problem when presenting the results. He says is the question from...
Yeah, that's a question from Bo Rothstein, forwarded by Gustav. Yes, so that's the question about the experimental design here, and how you deal with it. Who feels equipped to answer that question?
Yeah, well, I can say something about it. So what happened is in these 6 cities that were conducting experiments within the remit of the participation law, and were sort of singled out by the government to report their stuff. They were subjected to a very close analysis of the Bureau for Economic Analysis in Holland, which is a policy think tank that is obligated to report to the government when asked. And what they asked the government was, well, how is it going with these experiments? And what came out was a very detailed analysis involving some remarks on this problem of people being affected by the mere fact that they are under scrutiny in an experiment. Now, I think the question posed, if I sense it right, the question posed has an aspect of, don't you think that the results of the experiments in the Netherlands or elsewhere would be biased by the fact that people are slightly changing their behavior when under scrutiny? And I think that is right, but there is also a suggestion here that it might be biased only in one direction. And that, I think, is unwarranted. I think that this effect of being under scrutiny can take many different forms. And if those many different forms are distributed randomly over people, then they cancel out. So the question posed should be made more precise with respect to what kind of bias is expected here, given that basic income, admittedly, is such a controversial thing. So I would play back the question in this form.
Thank you. Yeah, so I see you distinguish between systematic and non-systematic effects here, and maybe if it's a non-systematic effect of the Hawthorne kind, maybe it's not such a big problem. All right, I think we have to draw to conclude the seminar now. It's been going on for an hour and a half, and that's the time we set out for the seminar. And I thank so much Simon, Jürgen, and Robert for your participation here and for writing this report for the Institute. It's been a great discussion, and I also thank the members of the audience and Julia for managing the questions. And we look forward to meet you again and to hear more about the progress of universal basic income in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Okay.